Good afternoon, Oakstone. Happy Sabbath to everybody. Happy Sabbath to everyone on the stream as well. Thanks for being with us and thanks for tuning in. Thanks to everyone who came out in person today. We're just really glad that everyone is here. Let me get this login done. I always talk and think I can do two things at once, and inevitably I bomb out at one or both of the things. So multitasking is not in my wheelhouse. And now Windows is punishing me for typing the wrong password. So we're going to just try. Here we go. Oh, I got it. Excellent. Jude 1:21 says, keep yourselves in the love of God. This is the essence of what I want to talk to us about today. This is the most simple message we could bring, and yet it is a challenge, and it is something we all need to work on as a whole, as a church, as individuals. And so here we are in a new year, at least on the Gregorian calendar. And some of us have made resolutions. Others of us are like thinking about making resolutions, even though we're a little late for that. And others of us are like, resolutions are pagan. So, and if you're not sure why, it's just like, I guess the Romans used to promise to be good in the new year to Janus, January Janus, and so there's this association with paganism. But here, it doesn't matter if it's a new day, a new week, a new year. It's always a good time. Those are just measurements of time, okay? So, but if it causes us to pause and to introspect and to reflect on who we are, where we are in our walk, then it's a good thing. And we can use that. If we use it at the New Year as an impetus to take stock of where we are, then let's do that. But really, this is something we should never put off in the first place. If we're like, hey, it's early December, we're going to wait till January 1 before we start behaving, well, then we're misusing that, right? But it's never, we should never delay putting off a spiritual realignment or an implementation of goals, atop an artificial framework of men's calendars. So that's all I'll say on that. But within the context of resolving or recommitting, or maybe some of us are doing that, and why not? It's as good a time as any to do that. So I want to consider that. With that in mind, I want us to take stock of where we as a congregation find ourselves in our walks. Be it physically and spiritually, we can assess where we are. But especially spiritually is where I want us to take stock of. And for sure, we're all here in different times and places in our lives. We're here in different times in our walks, different places in our lives. Some of us are married, some of us are not. Some of us have kids, some of us do not. Some of us are retired, some of us are still working. We all have come from different places and backgrounds, and we all bring different situations. But we have the one thing in common, that we're all on this walk together, aiming and angling towards keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, and walking this out together as we're able, as best we can, as the Spirit gives us the ability. Other things are certain in common, that we, being flesh, we're all presented with the temptations of the flesh. This is common to all men and women. Our battle, another thing we all have in common, is our battle is not against flesh and blood, it's against spiritual forces of darkness in high places. And the other thing that is true is that we are all subject to the distractions that society places in our way, upon us, and all these things. We are nonstop distracted, or have that capability to be nonstop distracted from society by its very design. Its design is to get our head down on the things of the earth, stop from looking up, and start to looking down on the things of man. So if you've taken this opportunity at this time of year, perhaps, or any time of day, daily, weekly, to genuflect, and if you are human, you will have found that you have fallen short in some of these areas, any of these areas, maybe multiple times over. And the reason is because we can drift, or we can be subject to drift. Not that we should, but that we can. As humans, it's very likely and plausible that we will drift around from time to time. Again, that's not an endorsement that we should, but it's an acknowledgement of the reality that as humans, we are not yet perfect. And so there's two questions that we want to ask ourselves. And not just now, but we should ask ourselves often. And I'm going to use these, and I think I would encourage you to all use these as litmus tests. I'll give you the first question now, and on the second question later. And I've given this question before. It's been a couple years since I've used this question, but So maybe some of you were here, maybe some weren't. But it's an excellent litmus test question to keep asking ourselves routinely. And by show of hands, here's the first question, right? Do you love God? I hope we all raise our hand. Okay? Now, you don't have to raise your hand for this, but you can if you want. But now let me ask you, are you walking in full obedience to God? And a whole lot less hands go up, maybe by design. But these are actually the same question. It's the same question. Do you love God? Are you walking in obedience to God? They're the same. And why is that? Because John 14 and verse 21. Let's turn over to John 14 and verse 21. It says, he who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. And notice the order here. The one who has the commandments of God, the sentence is sort of inverted, but it says he who has commandments and keep them, who is it? It's the person who loves God. It's basically saying, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And 1 John 5:2 underscores this. It says, by this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep his commandments. So in this case, it's talking about other men. And 1 John, the next verse says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. So the follow-up is, are we finding obedience to be difficult, perhaps? Are we finding things to just become routine or boring in our lives? Are we finding that we don't want to spend time in the Word? Or are we finding we might slip into sin too quickly? If this is the diagnostic of where we are, it indicates that we have allowed our hearts to move away from the love of the Lord. Because if obedience flows out of love of the Lord, you can infer or extrapolate out that a lack of obedience stems from a lack of love from God. It logically follows that. So if this is where we find ourselves, if we find ourselves in a place where obedience is challenging, or we find that we are strong-arming the desires of the flesh, and then our heart continues to lead us into places of temptation and sin, it's okay to be honest with ourselves and say, look, it's a good chance that I've allowed my heart to move away from the love of the Lord. And it's important to be honest with ourselves about this too. Because we don't want to say that, but it's important to acknowledge that. Because the first thing first way of addressing a problem is acknowledging that it exists. Would you agree? And so while we never want to say, oh, I've drifted from the Lord, it's important to acknowledge that, because then we know how to start to begin to address it. And the good news is that the entirety of the Bible, illustrates that if this is where you find yourself, the Lord desires that we would turn and that we would repent. So that is excellent news. It's not a surprise to God that we're capable of slipping, that we're capable of drifting off or drifting away. It doesn't come as a surprise to God. He understands our frame, and Jesus understands how we have to walk on earth, because he walked it out as well, and he understands the nature of temptation and how it comes. It's just that he never succumbed to it, and we as less than perfect humans do at times. And so I'd like us to keep that in mind. The first question to always remember in the litmus test is, do we love God? And if we do, are we walking in obedience to God? So that will give us a good compass calibration as to where our hearts are. Note, though, that if we obey without love, what do we call that? Because when we start with obedience, but we don't have love, that's called legalism. And we talk about that quite a bit here, but it always bears mentioning, because it's something that we wrestle with as humans, that wrestle with especially in the Sabbath-keeping community. But the deal is with legalism that it attempts to shortcut the relationship and the love that we can express towards God. It attempts to shortcut that through formula. whatever the plural formula is. I think it's still said formula. But it attempts to shortcut relationship that way. It basically says, if you do the thing, well, you'll please God then. And so just do the thing. And therefore, you will be justified in His sight, and you will therefore love God and show that you love God by just doing the thing. But Scripture indicates that the order is you love God, and so therefore you do the thing. And we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I want to give you litmus test question number 2 right now. Do you love God? Yeah, we should all say yes. Are you walking in love towards your fellow man? We try, right? We all try. How are we doing in that? Because if someone says, in 1 John 4:20, it says, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, now hate's a pretty strong word, but Jesus, defined hate, defined murder as to even hate or to be angry with without a cause. So if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? So this is another indicator that can tell us the nature and the state of our heart. How is it we feel about other humans? How is it we feel about other humans who we happen to disagree with? How is it we feel about other humans that are on the opposite political aisle? Or how is it we feel with other humans who do opposite of what we think they ought to do? If we're hating these people, or hating them in our hearts, or hating them by our words, or maybe even just generally being annoyed by them, or we look down on them because they don't believe the same as us, or we fill in the blank, there's a good chance that there's something indicating there's something wrong with our heart. And by the transitive property, if we don't love God, we can't, love our fellow man, we can't love God. According to the 1 John 4:20, it says you're a liar if you say that. If I love God, but I don't really love my fellow man. So again, point number 2 is, in order to take an assessment of where our heart is, first look at, what do I feel towards God? And then point number 2 is, or do I love God and therefore am I obeying God? Is my life demonstrated out? Am I walking in obedience? And 2 is, do I love God? Okay, then let's assess that by how I'm treating my fellow man, how I'm showing love to them, how I'm walking out the love that Jesus has for us and reflects towards us, towards other believers, and yes, not believers, or those who even believe opposite of what I believe. Religion without love is an empty shell. It's an empty vessel. It formalizes and it structures habits, and it assigns the righteousness that we can gain to the actions themselves. In a case study of this, oh man, did they get beat up on in church often. Case study of this is the Pharisees, right? They had all the framework and the trappings of religion, but they put first the execution of the law over the love of God. It was a political demonstration of a religious type activity, but that was filled with the busyness of obedience to every last thing, not underwritten by a deep love and abiding love for God and for their fellow man. And you can see this when they insist on paying tithes to the detriment and the ignoring of taking care of their parents. Jesus takes them to task for this. You can see this when they say, hey, I'm going to swear on the temple itself, rather than swearing on, they would swear by the temple or the gold that was in the temple, rather than the one who is supposed to inhabit the temple, God. So they're putting their focus on the things of the earth rather than the things that give the things of this earth, like a temple, its value, which is the indwelling of God's presence. And to some extent, we see this in other churches as well. Churches that, are considered God's churches, churches of Jesus Christ, churches of the Lord. This is a good example. This is in Revelation 21. Let's turn over to Revelation 2 and verse 1. This is Ephesus, and it's called the Loveless Church. I want to take note if we see anything that we recognize. Hopefully we don't, but there's always things that we recognize that may be common in our lives or common in the life of the church. Because as a church, as a collaborative or a cumulative body, we are all prone to fall into each of the areas that Jesus was reprimanding each of the churches of Revelation for. We're all prone to fall into those things collectively, and so and culturally. And so we want to just consider what we want it to be versus what it can be. And Jesus gives this directive to the church of Ephesus. To the angel or the messenger of the church of Ephesus write, "These things says he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your labor, your patience, and then you cannot bear those who are evil. And you've tested those who say they're apostles and are not, and you found them liars. And you have persevered and have patience and have labored for my name's sake and have not become weary." So far, so good. So far, they're doing great. There's things they have worked diligently and continually without having given up. And they cannot bear those who bring heresy or those who are say they're apostles but aren't. And so they have a dislike for the same thing, essentially, that God does not. God hates evil. They can't stand those who are evil. "Nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from your place unless you repent." So they were able to do important things. And let's kind of read between the lines here a little bit. This is a church who has left their first love. The first love, it doesn't really define what that is, but the first love, we can say, is the love of Jesus Christ as the head of all things, the love of the Lord. The thing that brought them there in the first place, presumably. This is the first love and the first works that led, the works that came out of having this first love. And so, maintaining works and labors in Jesus' name, doing so continually and persistently, and hating false religion and those who practice lawlessness. The implication here is that you can have a disapproval of sins or hate the things that God hates and not really be operating in a spirit of love. Put another way, sometimes we stand so much against all these different things that we forget to stand for or in the love of Jesus. Sometimes you can preach against something and get a whole lot more amens than if you're preaching for the love of God. Because it's easy to take a stance against something. We can intellectually agree that certain things are just wrong. And to some extent, but yeah, it takes God's revealing that to us. It takes the belief in the Bible that reveals that this sin or that sin or the other sin is wrong. But what we can do is kind of take that a little bit too far and say, hey, look, we stand against these things. And to be fair to the church of Ephesus, they were commended for standing against these things. But you notice they were able to do that without the first love. The implication is you don't have to have a whole lot of love towards God to stand against sin. Now, I maybe read into that a bit too much. But to be against heresy isn't the same thing as having a deep and abiding love for God. I think we've seen those people. We've seen people who take hardline stances against anybody and everything. There are Christians out there who make their social media presence or they make their ministry all about taking down all the other ministries rather than promoting the love of Christ. And maybe God has them doing that. I don't want to speak against it if that's what God has put them to do, because there may be a place for that. But as far as I'm concerned, there is a necessity for maintaining a deep love for God and maintaining the first works. This is what Jesus was saying. You can lose your lampstand if you don't have this. This church had done all of these different things, the works, the persistence of doing the works, and the labor and the patience. But without love, that tends towards false religion, and it kind of resembles legalism. Jesus, Jesus knows that this is the case. And in fact, this happened to Peter. You'll remember that Peter denied, he fell away from the first love, or the fear of man overcame his love for Jesus at probably the most inopportune time. When Jesus was about to be crucified and all of his supporters were there, all of them fled, and Peter most notably, because he denied Jesus to those who were asking him about Jesus. He denied knowing him and did so with vibrant language, shall we say. And so how does Jesus handle this? When Jesus, after the resurrection, Jesus is meeting back up with all of his followers. They're overjoyed to see him. And you can imagine, put yourself in Peter's shoes, he's probably just filled with shame. And Jesus doesn't berate him. He doesn't dress him down. He doesn't take him to task, but he's gentle and he's kind with him. And he says this in John 21, verse 15. So when they'd eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And he points presumably to the others. And Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." And he said to them the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because he said this to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now, I'm going off of memory here, so I may have this wrong. I forgot to look in this. But hidden in the Greek, we say love, 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 love. But in the Greek, if I remember correctly, and someone should check me on this, but Jesus is asking Peter, "Do you agape me?" Agape is the highest form of love. You have agape, philos, eros, so with like romantic love, brotherly love, and then agape is the peak form of love. It's really no kind of, it's like a word that's only defined by how it plays out in the New Testament, if I remember correctly. It's not really seen much outside of that in the Grecian world. But he says, do you agape me? And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philos you." And then he says, "Simon, do you agape me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I philos you." It's like he can't bring himself to say, "I fully agape you," because I know what I've done. And so Jesus kind of comes to him, and then the third time, I believe, if I remember correctly, he says, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you philos me?" He says, "Yes, Lord, you know I philos you." So Jesus is gentle even in how he approaches, but he lifts us up and asks us to love him more. He reaffirms the need for us to love him in order to walk out the ministry that we've been given, to feed his sheep, to tend his sheep, to feed his lambs. And whatever ministry you may have, God is asking you through Jesus to love him, to philos him, to agape him, to have the highest form of love that we can for Jesus and for the Lord, because when we do that, he can enable us to walk out the ministry that we have, to tend his sheep, to minister to others as he gives us the opportunity to do so. And this love, you see, the love that we are to express towards him, Jesus then gives us an action to do. It's love and then action that flows out of that. Do you love me? Then do this. It's not do this and in so doing learn to love me. It's love me first and the actions flow out. And so because love for God is so important, because it is the foundation on which our obedience hinges, it's the foundation for which the maintenance of a lampstand of a church is hinged upon. I want to spend some time going over what it is we can do to rekindle a love for the Lord if that's where we find ourselves. If our litmus test shows that we're coming up a little bit short, if maybe we don't have the love for our fellow man that we need, or if we don't have the love for God that has been demonstrated by our continued obedience toward him, then let's talk about how we can rekindle the love for the Lord in terms of human relationship. And we're going to take a stab at this. In human relationships, this is, I think we've all been familiar with it. I don't know who originated this concept, but the 5 love languages: words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. Briefly want to talk about how we can demonstrate these, to what extent they can be demonstrated towards the Lord, in order to foster not only our love towards him, but the love in our hearts toward him. Because if we can maintain that, everything else will flow from there. And this is just, we'll briefly touch on these 5 love languages. There's other things we can do. But the words of affirmation, this is the first. This is words of affirmation. If you have a spouse or a significant other, you would be giving them words of affirmation. If this is their particular love language, they would feel extra ministered to. You did great. Good job, right? I'm very appreciative for who you are and for what you do and what you do for this family. Words of affirmation are very much rooted in gratitude. You won't find a lot of affirmation or words of affirmation going out to someone if you don't appreciate them and appreciate for them for what they do or have done for you. And so with God, if we want to show him words of affirmation, another term for this is praise and thanksgiving. Hebrews 13:15 supports this. It says, therefore, by him, let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. The fruit of our lips. Second is quality time. Not only does Bible study qualify for quality time, so does prayer and worship. If we want to spend quality time with our significant other or our spouse, and we just do, we go and we find something to do together, or we just have time conversing together. This is completely not off the table with God. To spend time praying to him, to spend time understanding what he's telling us through his word. Prayer and worship. Worship counts as quality time because you are coming before God's throne to lay down before him, to kneel before him, to bow your head before him, and to spend your time with him. I think that is one of the challenges and why distractions that this world gives us are so potentially damaging to our relationship. Because just as with a human relationship, we can have the best intentions in the world saying, yeah, I want to spend that time with my wife, or I want to spend that time with my friend, and then allow for anything else to get in the way. If we ignore that friend, eventually we don't maintain the relationship and we drift. Third love language is receiving gifts. So some people are completely motivated by demonstrating their love through giving of gifts. And oftentimes, those same people are the ones that, if someone really wants to give you a gift, just know that they're probably also, that is their love language, is receiving of gifts, okay? Just a little hint there. That's been my experience anyway. But the question becomes for God is like, well, yeah, what can we really give God that he doesn't already have? Of course, we can give him offerings, we can give him tithes, but God says, offerings are not really what he wants. It's obedience is what he wants. And so, since we're talking about obedience flowing out of love, we can just, again, we have to have the love, which comes from obedience flowing out of that love, I should say. I'm getting into circular logic. I'm confusing my brain. But coming back, receiving gifts. What can we give God that he doesn't already have? He has everything. He wants our hearts. He wants to give him that. And then Romans 12:1, it also says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Sometimes I think we think God owes us stuff. We ask him like he's the prayer genie, saying, I need this, I need that, I need that. Our job is to give ourselves to God. It's our reasonable service. We've been bought at a price. And to revisit the language of slaves, I give a sermon series, if you weren't here, talking about servants of God, bondservants. Bondservants is better translated, slaves of God. But if you've been purchased at a great price, it is presumptuous to think that we have claim to much. Although God does tell us to ask for what we need. He says, do ask because he's a good father and he will provide. But so often we get into this trap of saying, God is going to provide this great life for me. God is going to give to me. And that's where the prosperity, thank you. The prosperity gospel comes in and says that for some reason, we don't necessarily owe our reasonable service to God, but rather he owes some sort of prosperity to us, which couldn't be more mistaken biblically. But our job is to become a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God. It's a reasonable service for the purchase price that we have been bought at. And so this is the gift we can give to God. We can give ourselves, we can give him of our time, which ties into the prior one, quality time. But he asks for our hearts. Acts of service. This is another big one. If you want to serve the person who is ministered to through acts of service, it's making them breakfast in bed or something. Whatever that looks like in your human relationships, right? Going to help someone move, going to minister to them when they're in a time or a crisis or when they're down. There's any number of things. I don't need to belabor the point, but towards God, this is best demonstrated as we work towards our fellow man. And that ties in with what we talked about earlier, that if you love God, you will demonstrate that through a love shown out and handed out towards your fellow man. And I think it goes without saying that acts of service towards God are completely reasonable and to be expected. So we come to physical touch as the last one. This is kind of interesting. How do you get physical touch with God? And kind of the answer is that at present we kind of don't. But when Jesus was walking the earth, physical touch represented something. You'll recall that Jesus went and when the children came to him, he sat them on his lap and laid hands on them. And he was told, the kids were dressed down for going and bothering him. I guess, kids were looked on maybe slightly lesser than. Perhaps, to the business that Jesus had to pertain to. And, get away, kids. Jesus has stuff to do. Jesus says, no, let them come to me. And the touch indicated acceptance. And that's also played out when we see what Jesus did with the lepers. Lepers were outcasts of society. They weren't touched by anybody. They might maybe be touched by one another, but they aren't touched by anybody. If you haven't had human contact with somebody, this is why solitary confinement is a really nasty punishment. There's no human contact. There's no, socialization in conversation, but there's just no physical touch either. This is a kind of a important component of being human. But Jesus did that. He allowed the lepers, and he went and touched the lepers, which is something they had not probably experienced in years. He accepted them. And so we can demonstrate that out to our fellow man by giving them greet each other with a holy kiss or a hug or whatever, but also through accepting them. Don't accept their sin, but accepting them and helping to bring them to the Lord. So might be a bit of a stretch as far as physical touch is demonstrated towards the Lord, but accepting others and helping to bring them, letting them know they have a place in the Lord's kingdom if they make Jesus their Lord and Savior. So in remembering, and you remember the advice that Jesus gives to Ephesus, he says, remember from where you've fallen, repent and do the first works. So I want to talk about remembering where we started. Think back to what it was that brought you to the Lord in the first place. Now, some of you may have done it at the time because it was what you were supposed to do. I hope not, but that happens sometimes. It's sort of like if you grow up in a Christian household, maybe there's a reasonable expectation that, well, you're going to become Christian, and so sometimes there's a pressure to do that just to do that. But for the majority of us, I think there were things that worked in our life and sometimes it's where things fell apart, where we began to understand that, wow, I have made a mess of things on my own, and Jesus is the only way, and he's the one who extends me his love and offers me redemption from my failures and my shortcomings. And you begin to have this deep appreciation for that. And this is where the gospel is so important. when the gospel, when it says that we are sinners, and we fall short of the grace of God, but for the redemption of Jesus in his blood that has bought us at a price, so often we hold on to that. We say, we are sinners. We are sinners. And that is important to remember because it reminds us from whence we came, but we don't hold on to that identity because through the power of the blood of Jesus, we are able to overcome through the love of the Lord for us and us returning that back to him, we are able to overcome. We don't make the sinner part our identity, so we don't continually beat ourselves up for that. But we overcome, we remember why, the point of having that is we want to remember where we came from and have the appreciation and the gratitude never far away from us. Let that not be 20 years removed if you've been walking with the Lord for 20 years. Let that memory not be left 20 years behind you. Keep in mind where it was you came from. Again, not to beat yourself up, but only so that you maintain that gratitude towards the Lord. So you remember where things were at the start. You remember how you felt towards the Lord in the initial stages of your relationship. I remember when I was first baptized, there was this just comfort in knowing that I am the Lord's. There was a lack of distraction from the things around me in terms of the things that the world tries to pelt you with. So you remember to the early things, and this is similar to what marriage counselors, I think, I haven't been through marriage counseling, but I think in any relationship, they tell you, look, if you're having difficulties, if you're like saying, who even is this person who I married, or who even is this person who I'm having such difficulty with, say, remember back to the thing that made you fall in love with that person in the first place. So you see them in that different light. You don't see them for their present reality. You see them for what you once saw them as. Now with Jesus, there is nothing that he can do against us sin-wise. He only has our good in mind. So we don't have anything, things that he has acted against us to hold against him, but we do need to remember what it is at the beginning, at the start, that he did so that we can have that informing our gratitude, informing our opinion of him. And then remember the zeal, the appreciation you have for being saved, for being redeemed. And then you appreciate the person. You come to appreciate the character. You come to appreciate the beauty. You come to appreciate the things that comprise this person. You begin to appreciate their intellect. And, early on in relationships, oftentimes people are just attracted to the outside of a person. But as you grow in a relationship with someone, you begin to appreciate their mind and their heart more. I still find my wife to be completely beautiful, but I'm really grateful for her brain and her heart, because that's what she'll hopefully always have, even as looks for both of us as we get older will eventually diminish, because looks are fleeting, but the heart and the mind, these are the things that we come to know. And so as we come to understand the beauty of Jesus, that now the word gives us descriptions of his beauty. We won't really fully appreciate that until we see him face to face. But we can come to know his character because his word tells us about that in great detail. The thing is that if we're not studying this to learn about it, if we're studying this to learn about doctrines are important. If we're studying this to prove someone else wrong, that has its place. To study this, to understand and to know the character of our God is the purpose of this book. The main purpose. Yes, it's a rule book for life. Yes, it's the roadmap to salvation. But first and foremost, I would submit to you that this is to know the character of God. To know wisdom, to know his son, not wisdom's son, God's son, to know who these great, awesome beings are that we worship, or that we claim that we worship, and we claim that we follow. In this new year, let us resolve to renew our hearts and minds. When we renew our hearts and minds and build up our love towards God, what will come from that is a beautiful walk. Romans 12 and verse 1. Romans 12 and verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. We already read that part. Holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. But now verse 2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of the Lord. The will of the Lord is that we obey him, that we walk out him, that we have love for him that results in our obedience. I've used this out. I hope I haven't overused this analogy, but I'm constantly just struck by chickens. Yes, I haven't mentioned those in a while. If you're new here, there was a time in my messages when I was raising chickens quite often, and so lots of chicken analogies would make their way into the messages, and we've moved past that a little bit. Maybe I've matured or something. So. I've gone and lost my train of thought. Thank you. I'm going to read that verse again, and it'll probably put my brain back on track. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and you may prove to be good, acceptable, and perfect will of the Lord. There it is. Okay. I use this a lot. I'm constantly amazed by the analogy and what must be a very similar interplay between us and God as I see it demonstrated and played out between myself and my children. Because when I tell my kids to do something, I don't want mindless obedience. I want to demonstrate and explain a principle to them so that as they learn the principle, I don't have to keep telling them the same thing over and over and over. I tell them, look, kids, don't go into the shop without my being there. At least Shiloh gets that one. Because there's a lot of things in there that will hurt you. And she's a little clumsy. And so, but I can't really explain that to her. I'm just saying, you can't go into the shop right now. Okay? But sometimes when I'm not looking, she goes into the shop. Now, she's gotten a lot better about that through discipline. And just as God disciplines us, he, through different various means, we discipline our own children to set their mind and to understand there's consequences for disobedience. But as I see it, I don't want to begin to constantly have to tell her, don't go into the shop. And the reason being is that I want her to understand the principle after a time. I want her to understand that it's not that the shop is inherently bad. It's that there's stuff in there that will hurt you and that you don't know enough to stay away from it, or you're not able to comprehend that if you knock that over, it'll knock this over, and then all of a sudden there's a ladder falling on top of you. And so with kids, I'm losing this analogy. I'm sorry. I'm wanting to explain something a little deeper with kids. What I see with my children is that I see sometimes mindless compliance. And I think Adam's used this analogy before, but I'll use it. When I say, you need to apologize to your brother because you hit him, saying, sorry, that's not the idea. The idea is I want to see a repentant heart. The demonstration in walking out of my command without the heart being proper behind it doesn't really result in obedience. It results in the trappings and the demonstration of what appears to be disobedience, but something I can see through immediately. When one of my kids accidentally hurts another kid, and I say, well, how is it you're going to do something to minister to them, to make them understand that this was an accident, I didn't mean to do this, how can you help piece them back together? That's what I'm trying to create, a culture where that happens. What ends up happening oftentimes is they say that they'll accidentally smack someone as they're playing. It was an accident. Okay, so they use that as a get out of jail free card. So it was an accident. Okay, we can have accidents happen, but then what is it we do with it? Do we just say it was an accident? Because that demonstrates a heart that's not really repentant. It's not really wanting to obey the idea of we don't want to harm our fellow man. And so I'm not sure I'm explaining it very well, but what I see more and more as I parent my children is I see that obedience, when it's stemmed in a love, in a proper fear from daddy and mommy, is the type of obedience I want, because then it's just embedded. It's not a rule by which to abide by. It's just an understanding that this is the way the family behaves. And I think that's what God is asking for from us so much more. It's that if our hearts are aligned to Him, we won't go around accidentally hurting our brothers and sisters. Why? Because we're proactively looking to prevent harm from coming to them. And if we do hurt them, it's not just a sorry. It's a how can I help make this better because of something I've done? That's how we demonstrate that out to our fellow man. When it comes to God, if we don't walk out with Him, if we don't walk out what He has said, we may receive punishment from Him. But we don't just take it and move on until He's not looking, so to speak, and then do it again. We take that and we begin to say, if I'm obeying, I need to understand why it is that I'm doing that, because clearly I'm not respecting God or looking up enough to have, I guess, a heart that sees His heart. When we see His heart for what it is, as it's revealed here and as He reveals it to us in our walk, I think the proper response can only be gratitude, and we begin to have a deeper love for Him. It's a God that says, God says, don't steal, but you can flip that on its head and said, be generous to others. If the law reveals the heart of the lawgiver, which I submit to you is true, and He says, do not steal, what does that say about God? It says that He is a generous, kind, compassionate, giving life giver. He doesn't steal and take away and murder. No, He's a life-giving God who gives and who is generous towards His creation. That's somebody we can love. That's somebody who's worthy of our love. That's somebody whose heart is for us. And so we shape our hearts towards Him, and we show that by demonstrating love to Him, and through that love, we demonstrate our obedience. All right. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 15 as I begin to wrap this up. Verse 15. For all things are for your sakes, that grace, having spread through the many, may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, it's talking about in this life, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, and the things which are not seen are eternal. How do we renew our mind day by day? Part of what this scripture tells us is that it's a recognition and an understanding that what we think, what we believe, affects us so drastically in this life. It's not really it. That's a light affliction, and it's but for a short moment. The thing that we think is the biggest deal in the world to us, and for sure there are things to grieve, there are things that are difficult, that make our lives difficult, but look, that's the temporary things. And God's saying, keep your eyes on what's eternal. Keep your eyes on that which is not seen. And remember that your affliction is light. And renew your mind with this day by day in the inward man, and therefore you don't lose heart. That's what happens if you read it backwards. If you go from verse 18 up to verse 16. And when we do, we'll have thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God, recognizing His grace and that all things are for our sakes. So if there's a resolution for this church in the coming year, let me submit that it be that we renew and bolster our love for God, and renew and bolster our love for our fellow man. We're going to have a cultural meeting next week, and so much of what we're talking about today will be played out in more detail of how that manifests and plays out as the culture of a church as we discuss that next week. But for now, just understand that there is a single source from which that comes. That is the love from God. A church that loves God will also love their fellow man, will obey God's commandments. If we're having problems with either of those two things, it's a diagnostic to point back saying, hey, we need to have a bit deeper and a more abiding love for God. That's your homework. If that's where you find yourself, if that's where I find myself, that's our homework, okay? Because the church is just an aggregation or a combination of each person operating independently to some extent. But as we come as independent humans, we come together and operate in a community, what each of us brings to the table, be it good or be it bad, will have a cumulative effect on the church. And that's what we call church culture. So we're going to be talking about that in the coming week. But this is the higher level view of that. I'd ask that we awaken and see where we are in history, recognize that the church has her place. You have been placed in this church at this time. You have been placed at this time in history so that you may have your effect on the world, that you may walk out the calling that God has given to you. You may walk out the demonstration of obedience as is driven by the love of the Lord, and that you may walk out love for your fellow man as we love God. Romans 13:10 says, love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this, knowing the time that now it's high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand, therefore let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. May we go forward this year in love for God, love for the Father, love for Jesus, continually recommitting and renewing our minds towards him, understanding who he is and his character, and understanding that we owe him as a reasonable service our love, and all good things will flow out from there. So let's go forward in that promise and that premise, and let's get together and worship him right now.